Well, as you can see, the title of my presentation is Downsizing and Upgrading. Sort of variation on the theme, is bigger always necessarily better? And then a hidden recommendation and an indirect speech act, why we need more spoken, more multilingual, and more non-standard corpora. By way of introduction, I guess a few reflections on the role of technology in the analysis of linguistic data, followed by 30 years of English corpora, a personal look back and lessons learned, I hope. Then a few comments on politics of digital infrastructure and relatively open conclusions. Okay, so here we go then. Has it really always been from low-tech to high-tech? Did linguistics start as a discipline where a pencil and a notebook and an occasional glass of red wine was enough to produce first-rate work? If you look at native speaker introspection, well-established methodology in formal linguistics, you could still have the idea that this is the case. On the other hand, crucial dependence on native speaker introspection would put linguists like me, who are not native speakers of English, at a distinct disadvantage. So maybe that's why I went into usage-based and corpus-based modeling. Anecdotal, unsystematic observation and collection of examples, time-honored methodology, which is open to experts and non-experts, native speakers and non-native speakers alike. Systematic fieldwork, still somewhat low-tech. Then elicitation, starting out as a low-tech procedure, questionnaires on paper and so on, but then of course involving stuff such as sophisticated psycholinguistic experimental designs involving eye tracking, very precise reaction time measurements and so on, all the way to the latest work in the neurolinguistic lab. And then our joint concern, ever more sophisticated corpora. So let me take back, because Birmingham is where, among a number of other places, it all started, to the early days of the pioneers. You recognize Jeffrey Leach, Randolph Quirk, Francis Kuchera, Stig Johansson, and a few others. The obvious personality missing is, of course, John Sinclair. And because legend has it that he is commemorated in one of David Lodge's campus novels, I thought I would give him presence even before the Sinclair lecture by a few quotations, which I think are quite enlightening in showing us how far we've come along. So, halfway through the quotation anyway, he went on, "When we heard that the university was going to give you an honorary degree, we decided to make yours the first complete corpus in our tape archive." Tape archives and computers, that was long ago. You would have to explain this to young people. "What does that mean?" I said. "It means," he said, "holding up a flat metal canister, rather like the sort you keep film spools in. It means that every word you've ever published is in here." His eyes gleamed with a kind of manic glee, like he was Frankenstein or some kind of wizard. "What's the use of this?" I asked. So you see, the corpus linguist in the early days, esoteric, secret, hidden knowledge, strange projects, probably not of major concern or interest to other fields. Then putting the complete written, published works of someone into digital format. Now, a few decades later, I suppose it would be difficult to find people in academia whose complete published work is not available in digital format. And then, what's the use? Let's show him, Josh. And he passed the canister to the other guy, who takes out a spool of tape and fits it into one of the machines. And the machines would not refer to portable devices, laptops. The machines would be the mainframes in the computer center, which all of us walk past every day on our walk down from the Vale. So personnel intensive, cost intensive, machinery intensive. Then, what's your favorite word? Basic concordancing, what Andrew called our weapon of first and last resort. I'll leave you to read this silently to save time. And for those of you who have not read the novel or don't remember, the crucial word in this particular instance is Greece. Now, 50 years on, corpus linguistics has changed its shape. Corpus linguists are no longer a set of closely knit communities growing up around specific resources, like the Brown and Lobb community or the Bank of English community. Corpora are everywhere. People who would not describe themselves as corpus linguists use corpora routinely in their work. And rather than having a solid body of texts, which is digitized, we now have a complex corpus linguistic working environment, which ultimately dissolves into the web, as Gatto in her 2011 article has nicely pointed out. So I would say some aspects of corpus linguistics have become part of general computer literacy for everybody growing up these days. Other aspects of corpus linguistics have been exported into neighboring disciplines with interesting results. So that generally speaking, probably at some point we will have to think about how to reposition corpus linguistics as part of, and possibly even as one of the driving forces and continuing driving forces in an overarching digital humanities movement. But more on that later. So if you want that kind of new corpus linguistics beyond corpus linguistics in the traditional sense, I can refer you to the Stanford Literary Lab, where a couple of literary scholars have pioneered techniques such as distant reading, which is, of course, the opposition to closed reading of earlier decades. And you can see that in a project like the 18th century, the Emotions of London, you get all the elements which are at the cutting edge of progress in contemporary corpus linguistics. 18th and 19th century novels are notoriously brimming with emotions of all kinds, emotion tagging, semantic tagging, but where exactly do their characters feel anger, sadness, fear, surprise, and so on? Combining the resources of literary geography, which is some kind of geolocation used on texts or named entity recognition, and the potentialities of digital crowdsourcing. The Emotions of London is creating an emotional map of the English metropolis, charting the effective significance of the thousands of place names mentioned in 18th and 19th century novels. So you get denotation versus connotation, you get geolocation based on textual metadata, presumably. So it sounds very familiar in one sense and is yet undertaken for very different purposes. And probably there is not as yet much interchange. I said that doing a bit of corpus linguistics has basically become a general cultural technique. If you browse the web, it's full of people who play around with Google Ngram without any serious scholarly or academic ambition, and who produce stuff like the insight that if you do a Google Ngram research on mountain, it turns out that in American English, the frequencies of mountains are consistently higher than the frequency of prairie, which gives you a nice representation of the American landscape, I mean, the flat prairie. So this is how far corpus linguistics has spread. I mean, it amuses people who, for whatever reason, can't get themselves to go out on a particular evening. Right, 30 years of progress in English corpus linguistics. I've been very glad and to be, in my own modest way, part of it. And I think there's no doubt that the progress has been fantastic in terms of hardware, storage, and processing capacities. Progress has been fantastic in terms of corpus size. Software has made enormous strides ahead. Retrieval, statistical profiling, visualization of data. I mean, we have more tools than any single researcher can really keep track of, and they're doing a better job. And so for major languages, and even for some minor languages spoken by fewer people than English, Italian, French, or German, you can say that the amount and quality and diversity of digital language data is such as wouldn't have been dreamed of a few decades ago. So this is clearly positive. However, maybe it's onset of old age, but for the past 5 or 10 years, I've become increasingly irritated by complex annotation schemes. The time it takes to familiarize yourself with them, of course, you have to do it, and it's my fault if I can't make the time. But if you take, for example, part of speech tagging or parsing syntactic trees, it's not just about tagger or parser reliability. 98% on standard English for part of speech tagging is great. If you have a parser which works fairly well, it's great too. But even if we agree that the performance rates are sufficient, there still remains the problem that by using this annotation scheme, you buy into an implicit or explicit theory which may not be yours or which may not be the most appropriate one for the variables or the particular phenomena which you are investigating. So I'm tempted to recommend that regardless, use one annotation scheme, use 2 or 3, that's even better, but then go back to the original plain data, or if you're dealing with spoken language, go back to the original sound files, because they may point you towards phenomena which have been eliminated rather than highlighted by the particular annotation scheme. And where this is particularly evident, I think, is the treatment of spoken language in corpora, which I think for the past few decades very often has literally corresponded to the figurative expression reduce speech to writing. Speech is time-bound, speech is dynamic, speech is sequential with overlap, and in writing you have to handle this in ways which are clearly reductive. I will illustrate this by a few pieces of data. This is one of the legendary paper slips, millions of which were kept in the Survey of English Usage before digitization. It's a piece of spoken language, face-to-face interaction. I don't have the time, it's not necessary to go into all the detail, but what you have is an orthographic transcription with complex prosodic markup, intonation, and with all sorts of paralinguistic annotations, for example, regarding rhythm, that's the time element in spoken language, voice quality, like slurred and so on. In the pioneering digital effort, which probably all of us have worked with at one time or another, you have interesting additions. For example, every tone unit is numbered sequentially. And so basically you now know that you're looking at unit 139 to unit 164, which is great and convenient if you want to organize your data or you want to refer to the corpus, but it's not of intrinsic linguistic interest. On the other hand, because it was too difficult to handle on the computer, lots of the more fine-grained prosodic transcription and practically all the paralinguistic features have been eliminated. Now still, what we have is problematical because you see that in this version, the words are cut apart through the prosodic marking, which of course creates enormous problems for lexical searches. And I suppose at the time, storage was still an issue. Today, we can think of ways of solving this problem. So if you have a spoken corpus, why not keep available, if it's legally possible, the original audio files, which tend to be of better quality today than they used to be, then have a kind of consensus-based, very simple orthographic transcription, then align it to more complex transcription, and then give users an opportunity to annotate even further for their own purposes. So that would probably be a sensible working compromise to get around this problem. This is from a corpus in the compilation of which I was involved myself, ICE Jamaica. I was following orders, I'm tempted to say, because I was working according to a template, the ICE formula, but some things made me rather unhappy even at the time. For example, that you were supposed to transcribe longer coherent passages, and any interruptions had to be listed in sequence after the long utterance. I mean, that's not good raw material for discourse analysis. You can see that I'm struggling with keeping apart Jamaican Creole and Jamaican English. So if it's a Creole word like me fred, I'm afraid, different syntax, fred being a word, a verb, then it was tagged indigenous. If it was Creole, which looked in some way like English, and we didn't use the tag, so it's a rather artificial way of separating in the corpus transcription what in fact is the proverbial smooth Creole standard continuum which characterizes sociolinguistic reality in the Caribbean. Now I hope, Mark hoped that I would be here yesterday. I hope that Mark is not here today. Spoken language in the COCA corpus, use it for so many things, but probably don't use it for the study of contracted forms, however interesting this may be. Hafta, wanna, gonna, gotta, and so on. Before you even think about using COCA for a study of gonna contraction in American English, check the contraction ratios in the old 1990s Santa Barbara corpus, which is very closely transcribed real face-to-face interaction transcribed by experts who paid attention to that kind of thing. And you will find that they are much, much higher than in the more recent COCA data. The reason is obvious. The media transcripts, which represent spoken language in the COHA corpus, or the COCA corpus, are basically transcribed by relatively unskilled labor in terms of linguistic sophistication, and probably by people who do not get clear guidelines on how to handle these phenomena. So I would venture that if there is a conventionalized non-standard representation like gonna, you're likely to use it some of the time that the actual contraction is used. If there is no conventionally established non-standard orthographic representation, as in hafta, which is rarely used in comparison to gonna, or in trina, which is rarely used in comparison to trying to, then probably you won't even capture the various contractions. So we're in a fix, really, because one thing which you want to study is contracted forms co-occurring, which is a rare phenomenon. So they are not gonna, wanna, go, is clear, and probably was actually pronounced as gonna, wanna, go. But when in COCA and COHA, or in COCA you search for going to want to go, the full form, you find enormously high frequencies, and reading them out to yourself, they sound totally artificial. So my guess is that if I had time to go back to all of the YouTube videos which are available for the texts recorded in the COCA spoken corpus, then very often I would find that the unpronounceable going to have to or going to want to forms are actually pronounced as gonna, wanna in the original. So in a way, the problem we have is that we've achieved to collect, or Mark Davis has achieved, and thank you for that, has achieved the collection of the required amount of data, but there is a quality gap. And what we need, or what we would need, is actually face-to-face, spontaneous interaction of the type recorded in the old London Lund corpus or in the somewhat more recent Santa Barbara corpus in quantities which correspond to COCA. And it's not just organizational logistical reasons, as was pointed out in a number of presentations at this conference, the legal conditions for obtaining spontaneous spoken language data have deteriorated drastically. So Sir Randolph Quirk today would have 1 foot in prison for the surreptitious recording which he used to obtain data for the London Lund corpus. Now, go back to the classics, because you can learn a lot from them. The computer is a tyrant rather than a slave was an observation by the late Jeffrey Leach. You can even listen to him making this statement in a recording in the held in the ICAM archives. Then there is still a fair deal of Luddism, hatred of machinery about in the linguistic community outside usage-based and corpus linguistic modeling. Probably most of us admire the vast contribution of R.M.W. Dixon to usage-based syntax, English grammar on semantic principles, language typology. But I find him somewhat provocative when he assesses the value of computers. So what he says in his autobiography, which is worth reading for many reasons, not least of which is that it's provocative. He says, computers encourage laziness, which leads to a poorer product. So basically, somebody who produces poor linguistics is talking to an audience whose business is in poor linguistic research. Dixon can't be right, can he? So, provisional summary, is spontaneous face conversation naturally recalcitrant to the high-tech approach? Or have we merely missed the right approach? And what I would like to introduce now is an idea familiar from the history of science, the bottleneck idea. In the development of a discipline, there are various types of bottlenecks. And I think in corpus linguistics, you can see very precisely that there are conceptual bottlenecks and there are technical bottlenecks. In the early days, most bottlenecks were technical. For example, a program terminating because of insufficient storage space. You had the data, you had the program, but you couldn't run the concordance. And I think in the way we treat spoken language in corpus linguistics, we are at a conceptual bottleneck now. We need to think about what the right way is to handle spoken language digitally. That would, if we had the right way, this would open up the road to collecting multimodal corpora, which everybody is talking about in great quantity. And maybe after we've broken the conceptual deadlock and reached consensus, we can define a technological development agenda. If things develop the other way around, there is a danger that the engineers and the developers keep on working on masses of more or less standard-like written language and give us the tools to produce more of the same corpora ever faster. But in 20 years' time, we may still be looking at a wealth of written data and a relative dearth of high-grade, high-quality spoken corpora of natural interaction. So this is basically the written bias. In corpus linguistics, there is a template, the written corpus, and spoken language tends to be forced into that template up to a point. There is another bias, the nation-state perspective and the standard language bias. The most prestigious corpora are corpora of prestigious languages. If you remember the pioneering role of ancient Greek in the development of digital linguistics, would Greg Crane have got all the money for his projects digitizing the ancient Greek linguistic heritage if he had looked at non-standard American Spanish? I doubt it. So the prestige of Greek brought in some of the money, in addition to the efficiency of the researcher and the applicant, of course. So think about how many national corpora there are. It's like the national flag. And so, standard language corpora tend to be the most widely used. Non-standard language corpora tend to be used by smaller communities of researchers. So let's now think about the monolingual, nation-state, and standard language bias, which you find enshrined, for example, in corpora such as the ICE corpus and its bigger sibling, Mark Davis's GLOBE corpus. Basically, ICE corpora are not produced for Wales, Scotland and Ulster. They are produced for Britain, UK. They are produced for Ireland, the Republic of Ireland. They are produced for the Philippines. They are produced for nation states, post-colonial nation states sometimes. And again, you have a bias, you have a template, and you have a living, complex linguistic reality. And I shared a few memories of my own experiences compiling ICE Jamaica, but I find that people compiling ICE corpora in post-colonial context have exactly the same problem. This is Maria Lourdes Bautista talking about compiling the spoken data for ICE Philippines. This is the largest category in the whole of the corpus, and of course the category which people use ICE for, because you can get alternatives for the written ICE text anywhere you want. But the face-to-face interactions are really crucial. And in the Philippines setting, it was a very difficult text type category to collect. Natural conversations among family members and friends in Manila are typically concluded in Tagalog and, depending on the educational level attained, with little or much English and/or vernacular code mixing. For purposes of the corpus, the conversations had to be in English with minimal Tagalog insertions, and therefore the collected conversations are already less natural in that respect. The presence of the tape recorder contributed to even less naturalness. So you see, the ICE design formula forces you to put aside the most natural face-to-face conversation in the Manila region. Same problem for the media data. The most local, the most typical, the most distinct Filipino media interaction has to go out because it doesn't fit the ICE template. Now the good news is, in spite of the effort to sanitize the data, which you can read about in the manual, much Tagalog, or Tagalog fortunately, has slipped through. So we talked about Google Translate a little bit, and if you permit, or if you will excuse my French, as the old saying had it, it shouldn't have happened. All this should have been eliminated in ICE Philippines. But shit happens. In Filipino, this is translated by Google Translate as shit happens, and as a nice specimen, read what you have below. It's a very emotional discussion about the Chinese US medal or race for gold medals, for the maximum number of gold medals during the Olympics. And after you feed it into Google Translate, it will give you a rough idea what it is about. And what can you do with this? So in this little exploratory study, I have taken a generally relevant problem in world Englishes, that they're always used in multilingual settings, as opposed to L1 varieties, which are dominantly used in monolingual settings, in order to show that even such a relatively badly designed corpus for the purpose will allow you to make relevant observations. So what I'm looking at is formality, and not just formality in the L1 sense, where you have a decline of formality within English, but formality in the L2 sense, where you have the decline of formality that you have within English, and then another decline of formality which shows a correlation between readiness to take over or use indigenous language material alongside English in order to create an informal atmosphere. So call it global informality and local informality. Simple thing is the global informality, because if you take a simple variable like because and cause, which is systematically transcribed in this corpus, you see that in the spoken conversations in ICE Philippines, you get a vast dominance of the formal variant because. It's almost 8 times as frequent as the informal cause. And I guess the examples speak for themselves. However, if you look at Tagalog, there are alternatives, dahil and kasi, which is likely to be a loan from English, actually. And then you see how informality and the colonial history of English in the Philippines is actually emerging from the examples. Seguro, which is of course a loan from a previous colonial language, Spanish, as a discourse marker. Come to think of it, seguro in this case, a hidden camera is good enough, kasi walang ano e walang, I don't think, and so on. I mean, it's typical extract from a spoken language, and if I trust my Filipino informant, whom I consulted, walang ano e walang means you don't miss anything. So what the whole thing makes sense if you have closed-circuit cameras in place. Nothing was missing, nothing is missed. Now, here you could say code switching. Kasi indicates that you're switching from English into Tagalog. But what about the second example? Like what bad things? Well, before then tagging indigenous according to ICE rules, it was him and Bianca, and so on and so forth. Typical relationship talk, which is common in college dormitories, which provided most of the data. Now, in a way, you have the classic dichotomy. Is it code switching, longer stretches? Is it borrowing one word? But I think that's the wrong question in the Filipino English context. Because actually, it doesn't matter whether you consider this a one-word switch or an established borrowing. The main thing is that you can't speak Filipino English without occasionally using kasi either as a borrowing or in code switches. And this is what you can discover in ICE, in spite of the original ICE template encouraging compilers to eliminate this multilingual disturbing factor. So let's move on to something which is a little more encouraging. There could be a natural harmony between native-born digital data for digital corpora, and I've been experimenting, and that is the Cyber Niger project. Cyber Niger is the informal way of saying Cyber Nigerian. And note that I don't say Nigerian English in cyber communication. I say Cyber Nigerian because I think of this as a multilingual repertoire comprising international English, local English, Nigerian Pidgin English, and a number of indigenous languages. And I'm studying this in the frame of a sociolinguistics of mobility. If you're really interested in this, I suggest my English Worldwide 2013 paper. It will explain the background. I need to move on to the corpora. Corpus of Cyber Jamaican, called Cyber Jamaican because it combines English and Jamaican Creole or Patois. Cyber Cameroonian because it combines French, English, Confranglais, Cam talk and Cameroonian Pidgin English. And then Cyber Nigerian, which I will use for demonstration. First, before I give you the visualization and the statistics, a taste of the actual, slightly anonymized, though it's difficult on the web, the actual language you will encounter on this Nigerian forum. First, somebody who declares himself to come from a city in southern Italy, ma vivo in the UK. Please, I beg you to help me. I'm an Italian white man who has met this beautiful Igbo girl. This girl I'm in love with. She's married to an Englishman, but he doesn't treat her the way she should be. We are very closed friends. Any help from you Igbo people will be really appreciated. I thank you all in advance for your advices. I mean, this is basically lingua franca English showing typical learner phenomena with which we are all familiar, but it is part of the language you encounter in this globally dispersed community of practice. Now, I wouldn't ask for relationship advice on the web, being old school. Oka, that is a name of a participant, so that's what now? Are you sure you're not on the rebound? Because you sound sort of desperate. Also, the chick is married and you dare disrespect her marriage by involving herself in it. Come on, fellow. I know you're smarter than that. My diagnosis is for you to lay off the chick and really think to yourself that you actually love her, not infatuated by her. For your future reference, it's Igbo, not Igbo. The context shows that this is a first-generation Nigerian immigrant to the US who has obviously, added a fair deal of American idiom to her Nigerian English heritage. And the other one says, if you married her, you'd be headed for divorce soon. Maybe you'll be seeking help from Wolof folks this time. But then they relent, because the poor Italian is so lovesick that he's even gone to the trouble of becoming fairly fluent in Igbo just to please his beloved. And this softens the heart of the Nigerians. And they say, no wawen, which means my brother or sister. Mind you that you're on the outside looking in. About the comment about my culture, well, yes, it's frowned upon to divorce in Igbo land, but that doesn't mean folk don't get divorced. I must commend you for being able to write messages in Igbo. That is one up for you. Anyways, na, that is father, you can't do nothing. No matter how much you claim to love the Nyani, the woman, doesn't mean it will result in you all being together. So this is, again, the one in Houston speaking, who has switched to the un-Nigerian pronoun form you all. And then, in case you don't believe that we're dealing with English in multilingual context, I leave it to the Italians to judge the grammatical standard of the Italian who posts from Treviso in Italy. And, oh, I've given away the city in northern Italy now. And so you see that Nigerian Pidgin and Learner Italian produced by Nigerians come from northern Italy. Now, how do you, I mean, this is an interesting anecdote, but how do you get a handle on this? And our answer was data visualization, visualization of a very primitive sort. We basically ran a search for the indefinite article, which happens to occur in every single one of the hundreds of thousands of posts to the forum. And so basically, where you find a big circle, a lot of language is produced, and this is the location of the participants in space. And you have a trilateral post-colonial diaspora with one strong focus in Nigeria, one strong focus in immigrant cities in the US, one strong focus in Britain, but minor focuses in Japan, in the United Arab Emirates. And this is where we start, and we have metadata, at least for the most productive participants. You can do a gender breakdown, and you see that access to computers seems to be somewhat restricted for females in West Africa. That is the red segment. Whereas in the United States, you get a fairly even distribution. And in Canada and Britain, you get dominantly male participation. United Arab Emirates, so the Chinese Nigerian community and the United Arab Emirates Nigerian community is almost 100% male. And so you see, it's a very rough tool, but we can talk about migration, geographical dispersal, gender, and a few other issues. But of course, the linguistic issue which motivated this research was how global is Nigerian English as opposed to Nigerian Pidgin. So we're asking the question, Nigerians moving to the US, will they go on using the features of Nigerian Standard English, which they are used to from home? Will they go on using Pidgin, which might be an identity marker in the diaspora? And very simply, a very common Nigerian Pidgin form, Abi, is as globally dispersed as you can see. I mean, the representation is slightly different because for the whole state, you get a blue circle. And you do find Pidgin users spread throughout the entire world. Now, stuffs is one of the features which are described in handbooks as characterizing standard English in Nigeria. So these are this is a list of the rather irregular non-count nouns in English, such as equipment, furniture, support, which give trouble to L2 learners like me, and which tend to be pluralized in post-colonial contexts where local norms of English emerge. And so you might hear Nigerian Standard English speakers saying, I had to take all my stuffs into the other room, or thank you very much for your supports, sir, instead of thank you very much for your support. And what you see here is that there is a huge circle for stuffs in Nigeria itself, but it doesn't travel well. That means there's a conflict of prestige, and people realize that their own prestigious Nigerian English form is worth nothing to them in terms of social status when they go to Britain or the US. They give it up, they conform to the local norms. If you go to the informal English, I mean, there is the interesting peculiarity that dad is dad in British and American English, but mum is mom in American English, and it's also spelled differently. So let's see how Nigerians do. Colonially, through their heritage from British English, they have a preference for mum and dad, and Nigerians emigrating to the UK obviously see no reason to change it. Nigerians going to the US almost instantly change over to mom and dad, feed some of it back into Nigeria, where this might ultimately lead to a change from British to American orientation. And there's also a fair amount of American mom and dad used in Britain, introduced by Nigerians. So how many more minutes have I got, Jonathan? 10, okay, so I think I'll keep this brief then. What's the history and politics of digital infrastructure, of which corpora are an important part? I think we all know the individual great movers. There would be no brown corpus and probably no corpus linguistics as we know it without people like Nelson Francis, then later Jeff Leach and Stig Johansson. There would be no Bank of English without John Sinclair, no BNC without Randolph Quirk, and obviously no Coca-Cola without Mark Davis. But this is the benchmark. Google Translate has been mentioned several times at this conference. Ngrams have. And the problem with Google is obviously the black box and the lack of sustainability. Ngrams has been around for some years. It's still going strong. Some people produce papers using it, and some people refine it. But what about the Endangered Languages Project? Started with lots of fanfare by Google a few years ago. People contributed samples of dying and near extinct languages, and now it's all gone and has disappeared. There are the commercial providers who charge a lot of money, and then there are publicly funded strategy initiatives within the European Union and other countries. And the dangers and pitfalls that I see is that increasingly research questions tend to be dictated by infrastructure options. And that starts from the moment you need to find a BA or MA thesis for a promising student. They come to you, see you in your office hours for 10 minutes, and they have a good idea, and you briefly think and say, okay, I mean, look at the Santa Barbara corpus, do this in the latest update of the Brown family corpora and so on, or do this using ICE. But it also happens on a bigger scale. Where does the big money go, and what tends to be neglected? And sometimes maybe this is again a certain technophobia on my part, because my training was clearly philological rather than in information science. I sometimes do feel that infrastructure development is very often, the provision of resources is very often driven by engineers and developers, and that as a user you tend to have less and less of a say. And as a head of department, I'm also worried about the increasing budget. So many digital resources which used to be free are beginning to be commercialized, and in a modest humanities environment, this may really lead to painful decisions. Why is it obviously still worth it? Intelligent use of digital corpora, I'm firmly convinced, converts information and data into knowledge and insight. Widespread access stimulates further research research activities and cooperation. So this is community building, cumulative research, which is often held out as a model to the humanities and which can be done. And I have a lot of trust in the resourcefulness and the enthusiasm of young scholars, doctoral students, who really take the field further because they are among the first to use a new application for the study of intelligent linguistic problem. And last but not least, as a bit of an idealist, I think that corpora create a level playing field between rich and poor, as long as the stuff is open access, such as the BNC, between non-native speaker and native speaker linguists, and also between students and experts in the field. Because if it comes down, I mean, if you disprove a point on the basis of solid evidence, then your status in the community shouldn't really matter. Right, so here are my conclusions then. Technological enthusiasm, question mark. Technology is great. We wouldn't be where we are without it. But the question is, more data and more technology for ever bigger corpora, which tend to be written corpora and standard language corpora and monolingual corpora? Is that the way forward? And in order to give this a Birmingham twist, I searched the web and found a conference abstract for the 2007 Corpus Linguistics Conference in Birmingham by Kilgariff and others, who said that the title is BNC, a model passed its sell-by, no question mark at the time. And they made the point that the BNC was a great initiative and very successful when it was conceived, but that the advent of the web had changed the role of the game, and that it now no longer was a suitable model, because future corpora would be sourced at practically no cost from the web, and they would supersede existing corpora compiled in the traditional way. I mean, you I guess the presentation will be made available to conference participants, and I can refer you to the paper. And for spoken language, he says, or Kilgariff and co-authors say, for spoken language, the availability of transcribed material online and automatic transcription changed the landscape, with other major languages probably to follow. So the hope was that you would source spoken language from the web, which I think is only possible if you have a way of sourcing actual spoken language from YouTube. And I think the death of the BNC formula was pronounced prematurely, and it's not by accident that I think 5 or 6 papers were devoted to BNC 2014 and its continuing usefulness. So check your enthusiasm, especially when it comes to spoken language, face-to-face interaction, complex multilingual practices. It will be manual, intellectual, not automatic. So if only technological enthusiasm will dominate, corpus linguistics will go this way, which is too complex and too big and too statistical for me. It is probably also slightly problematical from my point of view, because as far as I was able to understand from this paper, what is behind it is very much of a bag of word theory of linguistic structure, which corpus linguistics can work against. So, Dixon once again. I've produced quite a lot. I mean, modesty is not his middle name apparently, so RMW, M is not for modesty. I've produced quite a lot, achieved a good deal. The question is occasionally posed, wouldn't it have been possible to achieve more if electronic aids had been available to you all along the way? Well, apart from the usefulness of computers for alphabetizing a thesaurus into a dictionary, the answer is an unequivocal no. The way I continue to be productive is by minimizing electronic reliance. I watch with sadness and wonderment as others flounder. That's you and me, apparently. It's a matter of sadness that they mess about in this way instead of doing linguistics. Language description needs linguists, not computer technicians. So we said people from Google should be here in the audience. Maybe he would profit from dialogue with us. And so it's probably a weak conclusion, but here I am preaching the golden mean on the basis of the history of corpus linguistics as I see it. As I briefly alluded to the bottlenecks, here we go again. There is a perennial challenge for usage-based models of language. Conceptual bottlenecks emerge after technological breakthroughs. So you have a tool which enables you to do great things. You end up in a conceptual theoretical mess. And then after you've thought through the concepts, then you can set the agenda for the next round of technological development. It's not as tidy and nice as that, but that would be the way forward. Be aware of conceptual and technological bottlenecks and how they relate to each other. And the big question which drives me and which has led me into corpus linguistics remains the same and is the one we are probably working on, all of us. Language structure cannot be fully understood without situating it with respect to current theories of joint action, social cognition, conceptualization of experience, memory and learning, cultural transmission and evolution, shared knowledge and practice in communities, and demographic processes in human history. That is the broad compass of usage-based linguistics, of which corpus linguistics is a very important methodological component. And I guess with the exception of demographic processes in human history, every single topic listed here has in some way figured in the conference program. So at this point, I've reached my very provisional conclusion, and thank you all very much for your attention after last night's partying.